Hello everyone, and welcome to my obligatory top 10 games of 2016 list, aka the only top 10 games of 2016 list that doesn't include Overwatch, aka hey fuck ass, it's almost March, aka dear god, how do I not turn this into a one-man circle jerk? Fuck it, I already gave my reviews the most circle jerky name ever, might as well just go full hog with it. Welcome to the actual top 10 games of 2016. Now, before I get into it, please bear in mind that there are a few games that came out this year that I didn't get around to playing or finishing that potentially could have wound up on this list if I had. Notably XCOM 2, The Witness, Firewatch, Divinity Original Sin 2, Enter the Gungeon, Dishonored 2, and probably a bunch of others that I don't care enough about to mention right now. I'd also like to ask you to bear in mind that none of these are my opinions. They are all 100% factual, objective truths, and if you disagree with them, then you're wrong, and I hope you enjoy being on fire forever. So let's just jump right the fuck in with Abzu, a game that has about as much going on in the gameplay department as the bonus disc for Herbie Fully Loaded. And while that may sound like an insult, or at least I hope it sounds like an insult, it's actually weirdly a big part of the reason that I enjoyed it so much. Abzu was a really nice break from the sort of games that I normally find myself playing. Yes, you can justifiably complain that it's short and lacking in any kind of meaningful gameplay, but I personally found it to be extremely relaxing, and because there was so much variety in the areas and creatures, I never found it boring or tedious to explore. It's a genuinely serene experience, and I feel that any game that makes me audibly say holy shit is at the very least worth mentioning. It may seem a bit odd that what's essentially one step above a walking simulator made it onto my top 10 list, but I personally don't really take issue with developers designing games around things other than their gameplay. And Giant Squid are definitely no strangers to doing just that. Outside of the undersea current sections and a few very basic puzzles here and there, Abzu's gameplay is pretty much entirely comprised of swimming around and looking at stuff, but I honestly don't really mind that about it because the sheer beauty and magnitude of it all was more than enough to pull me in. It's a testament to just how important good art direction is that with all the incredibly high fidelity AAA games that came out this year, the one that wowed me the most was a game about a blocky scuba diver thing. I don't even think Abzu would have been as effective as it is if it was realistic looking, partially because it would only run on fucking quadros, but mostly because the more fantastical elements would just feel kind of weird if they were hyper-realistic. It'd be like playing something along the lines of Superhot, only instead of fighting blocky red dudes in a series of white rooms, you were fighting actual people through a series of office cubicles. It would align with the gameplay about as well as my circadian rhythm does with a functional human beings. Now, I imagine that a lot of people would argue that Superhot's aesthetic design is a perfect example of style over substance, and I'm inclined to agree because that seems to have been the dev team's entire design philosophy while working on it. Take a bunch of really mediocre elements, make them all look and feel as stylish and cool as possible, and then wrap them all up with a very simple but unique mechanic, and I personally think it worked out pretty damn well. I don't necessarily know if Superhot is fun to play because it's a fantastic game, or if it's just because it's so innately different than anything else I've played in the past few years, but the fact that I enjoyed myself as much as I did is ultimately what counts. At the very least, I think it's a good game with a lot of style and personality, and I defy anyone to play through it without at least cracking a smile at how cool it feels to punch someone in the gut, grab their gun out of the air, shoot their friends with it, and then chuck it at their head to finish them off. Now, based on all that, you may reasonably be wondering why it's so low on my list, and the reasons for that are as follows. The game itself is incredibly short with very limited replay value, and the writing reminds me of the last time I tried Eat at Smash Burger, because both involve a dick and several small strokes. Don't get me wrong, I did enjoy the meta-narrative storytelling to a point, but I probably would have enjoyed it quite a bit more if the game hadn't been sticking itself so far up its own ass for doing it that by the time the ending rolled around it started coming out of its own mouth. Like some kind of horrific Cronenberg-esque monster that could only be found in the dark depths of the mind of Art Jensen, director of Playdead and lead designer on Inside. Some of you may be questioning the fact that this is so low on the list as well, considering that Inside is a decidedly artsy game and I am nothing if not a snobby, pretentious garbage bag full of empty Starbucks cups, but when I first finished it I actually came away more annoyed than anything else. Annoyed by the shitty puzzles, annoyed by the trial and error based gameplay, and annoyed by the lack of any concrete details about anything related to the game's narrative, as it felt like Playdead waving their fingers in my face and saying, "Ooh, what does it all mean?" But now that I've gotten a little bit of distance from the game and watched a few of Playdead's GDC talks, it's obvious to me that this collection of syllables and cancel signs had a very specific vision for the game, and it was pretty fucking unfair of me to be so dismissive and cynical about their intentions. I know, so unlike me, right? That being said, I do still think the puzzles are largely usually pretty fucking awful, as most of them fall into the same trial and error and gruesome child death category that most of Limbo's did, and the few that don't have so little depth that they don't really require the player to think all that much, which is a bit ironic given how diametrically opposed that is to the way that the game presents its narrative. It really is a shame, because Inside is nothing short of perfect from a technical standpoint. In fact, my biggest complaint about Inside is that it's so much more interesting to look at and talk about than it is to actually play, but at the same time, it's a game that I feel you really have to play in order to appreciate it properly for reasons that I find incredibly difficult to articulate. It's not like it's fucking Doom, where just by looking at a few screenshots you can pretty clearly tell that you wouldn't get even close to the full experience just by watching someone else play it. No, the reason you have to play Inside for yourself is a lot more nuanced than just having gunplay and a dynamic soundtrack so good that the rest of the game can just coast its way to winning several Game of the Year awards on that alone. Don't get me wrong, the gunplay in Doom is genuinely nothing short of fantastic, but aside from that and the aforementioned music, there really isn't fuck all to it, is there? I really do get the impression that this is a generational nostalgia thing that I just missed out on, as I'm 12 and didn't grow up on Doom, so while playing it I couldn't help but notice a lot of niggling flaws that I didn't really see many other people talking about. It actually has a lot of the same issues as the Ruby game, bizarrely. Now, it's obviously nowhere near the steel wool handjob of Grim Eclipse in terms of overall quality, as evidenced by the fact that it's on this list at all, but as I played through the game I couldn't help but see a few parallels. Oh boy, a closed off arena. Sure am looking forward to fighting off 5 waves of enemies until a door ambiguously opens and I can walk to another closed off arena where I get to fight off 5 waves of enemies until a door ambiguously opens. I hope this one's red and gray. I really like red and gray. Credit where it's due, the arenas are all individually very well designed and fun to gut punch demons in, and the mechanics are satisfying and well implemented. It's just that going from room to room shooting waves of enemies for an entire game with nothing to break it up isn't exactly earth-shattering design to me. I don't mean to get too down on Doom, as I obviously think that it's a great game. I just can't help but feel a bit confused by the sheer amount of praise that it's been showered in when it's so severely lacking in variety and has one of the most anticlimactic finales I've seen all year. Another weird parallel to the Ruby game. But more confusing in this instance, given that the other bosses were actually good. Bear in mind that if the core gameplay wasn't as polished and genuinely enjoyable as it is, these issues wouldn't be at the forefront of my mind. It's the disparity in quality between the elements that confuses and frustrates me. I don't know why I feel like I have to keep reassuring everyone that I like this game. Maybe it's because I have a sneaking suspicion that there are going to be a lot of people who are upsetty spaghetti that I had enough problems with Doom to keep it from being higher on this list. And if that alone doesn't turn the comment section into an absolute Call of Duty review, then the fact that it was edged out by Paladins of all things ought to do the trick. Nope, this is not a meme and it's not a joke. Paladins was genuinely one of my favorite games of 2016, and while it is technically still in open beta, I'm jumping at the opportunity to talk about the stupid controversy surrounding it. Now, since I do plan on doing a full review of the game when it officially releases and will no doubt still not be able to shut the fuck up about this when that happens, I'm going to try and keep this as short as possible. There are a lot of reasons that I personally prefer Paladins to Overwatch. The higher TTK, the customizable and versatile nature of its champions, the map design, and the lack of characters that make me want to throw heavy things at fragile things being a few of the more notable ones. To be as blunt and succinct as I possibly can, Paladins and Overwatch feel as fundamentally different to play as Overwatch and TF2, and if you dismiss Paladins as nothing more than the poor man's Overwatch without playing it for yourself, you're kind of a bandwagoning moron. It's fine if you don't agree with me about Paladins being more fun to play. I can fully understand why, but shit-talking something that you don't understand just because it looks kind of like something else you like is just plain old fucking dumb. I mean, in your defense, I've only been playing this game for well over a year now between the closed beta and the Steam release. You watched an entire 2-minute Donkey video. You're clearly the expert here. I mean, come on. Drogos is obviously a ripoff of Pharah, the most original FPS character of all time. Barrack is literally Torbjorn, the most original FPS character of all time. Fernando is practically made up of the same game files as Reinhardt, the most original FPS character of all time. And Kinessa? Pfft. More like Knitto Maker. How did they think they could get away with copying the most original FPS character of all time like that? For those of you wondering the context of the clips I just showed, they were taken from the game Global Agenda. You know, that high-res game that came out in 2010 and that Paladins is a spiritual successor to? Am I being naive about all this? Am I letting Hi-Rez take advantage of my innate desire to trust developers I like? I mean, they did customize the armor of the GA characters to look like their Overwatch counterparts, which is pretty sketchy. And come on, Makoa has a hook. Overwatch invented hooks. I mean, what's next? Am I gonna defend them when they release a gorilla champion who wears human clothes, some kind of eyewear, excels at close range combat, has a rampage ultimate, and whose name ends with stun? You know what? No, I think that'd be too far. Even I couldn't possibly defend such a blatant ripoff of Cheston from Super Monday Night Combat. Oh, shit! Look, I don't own an air horn, and this is the best I could do on short notice. On a serious note, I just don't understand the outrage over the fact that Overwatch has some actual competition now. Especially given that nobody was up in arms over the fact that the next game on this list pretty clearly took something of a quick glance at Telltale's notes before the final exam. And I'm sure you all know what that game is, but if you don't, I'll give you a few hints to help out. It's a story-driven game that follows a group of teenagers dealing with personal issues along with a supernatural force that manifests itself as a time travel mechanic, has a heavy focus on player choice, and evokes nostalgic memories of teen movies from the 80s and 90s due to its presentation, soundtrack, and an abundance of Polaroid pictures. Although a lot of the details and the chick with blue hair do a pretty solid job at ensuring that it still feels like a modern setting, so it's not so much nostalgia bait as it is hipster bait. Alright, let's all say it together now. Number 5 is Oxenfree by Night School Studio. Starting to understand why calling Paladins an Overwatch clone because of a rectangular shield is a bit fucking paste? All jokes aside, Oxenfree could very well be my favorite story-driven adventure game of all time, in spite of its length and noticeably cheaper presentation. There really isn't a lot that I feel comfortable saying about this game from a critical perspective, as there's really not all that much gameplay to speak of, and I'd have to dance around critiquing the story as it relies pretty heavily on player discovery. So I'll just say that the choices felt like they had actual implications for a change, and although some of the lines of dialogue were a bit clunky and awkward, none of them made me want to swallow a cheese grater, which seems to be the standard fare for these types of games. I have heard a lot of people complain about the movement speed of the player character being too slow, but in most instances I feel that it's used as a way to ensure that there's room for dialogue between set pieces, so I personally didn't really mind it. Hell, people made the same complaint about Alboy, and I love that game enough to make an entire video about it, so far be it from me to complain about that. Although if your entire exposure to Alboy was just my video, you'd be forgiven for not knowing that the game is actually quite flawed, because among other issues, a lot of the elements of its gameplay are just patently mediocre. In fact, if I decided to look at this game from a more critical perspective than I did, I could probably find a laundry list of problems with it, but I have no interest in doing that, because this is the first game I've played in close to a decade that's made me feel a genuine sense of wonder. And if I sat through the entire thing with a big fuck-off smile on my face, I couldn't help but feel a bit insincere if I turned around and acted like I didn't fucking adore it. Like I said before, I already made an entire video about why I like this game so much, so I'll just say this one last thing and move on. Alboy reminded me why I fell in love with gaming in the first place, which may sound a bit odd considering that it was beat out by 3 other games in 2016 alone, but being a critic, I can't fully ignore the fact that it does have some issues. One of the more notable being the fact that while it doesn't ever feel like it dips into the trap of being hard for the sake of hard, it doesn't have a difficulty curve so much as it has a difficulty staircase. One moment you're breezing through enemies that you can kill in 1 or 2 hits from a distance, and the next you're fighting Yorm the Giant without the fucking Storm Ruler, and for the record, yes, I did accidentally do that on my first playthrough. And you know what? I'm glad I did, because holy shit is that boss fight duller than a fucking top 10 list if you play it the way you're meant to. Actually, looking back, quite a few of the bosses in Dark Souls 3 relied pretty heavily on gimmicks. Something that From might have felt the need to do in order to distract players from the fact that it seemed more keen to iterate than to innovate. But to be honest, I don't really think that they needed to evolve the formula all that much anyways. The fact that I suck at Dark Souls more than I suck at most things and still fucking love it should serve as a testament to just how well designed the series is. Fuck, the first half of Dark Souls 1 is about as close to perfect as a game has ever felt to me, but that's honestly sort of the underlying problem with Dark Souls 3. Because while I'm glad it didn't try to unnecessarily innovate in the way that Dark Souls 2 did with the life gems and Majula, it's just sort of a worse version of Dark Souls 1. Granted, it's a bit difficult to complain about something not reaching a bar set somewhere in the mesosphere, it's just worth noting that, visuals aside, Dark Souls 3 doesn't really do many things better than Dark Souls 1 did. That said, I do think that Dark Souls 3 is a fucking phenomenal game in its own right. It's just that it's sort of left in this weird state of limbo, because despite the fact that it has more fan service than an anime series whose ratings have hit an all-time low, I can't help but get the impression that I'd have liked it a lot more if it was my first Souls game, because then it wouldn't just be constantly reminding me of something I liked more. Actually, I think the fan servicey bits would have been significantly cooler to me if I played through the games in reverse order, as they would have retroactively provided context to things that I wouldn't have given much thought to while playing through 3. Not to mention that I think it's a great jumping in point, as it's probably the most forgiving forgiving of the series in terms of difficulty, aside from the fucking pajama samurai who parries and combos like he's the Rider from Furi after he grew out of his rebellious phase. I make jokes, but as overdone as the whole retrowave aesthetic has become over the past year or so, I do still sort of adore it. And it's one of the reasons that Furi was able to grab my attention the way it did. What held my attention though was the fact that this game has one of the tightest and most gratifying combat systems I've ever used, as it had better given that that's what the entire game is built around. For anyone unfamiliar, Furi is a combination hack and slash bullet hell boss rush game that was apparently inspired by the game Nier, which I've never played but whose sequel is slated to have a PC release this year that I will absolutely be picking up just for a taste of what inspired this gameplay style. There is almost nothing about Furi that I disliked. Everything from the music to the visuals to the quirky characters to the story was more than enjoyable to me. Really, the only complaints I do have about the game are that the optional final boss is pretty easily my least favorite of the bunch, and that it would probably take me more time to properly explain all the reasons I enjoyed the game than it would take to play through it. But I think that's excusable, as the developers have outright stated that the first playthrough is intended to be a practice run for New Game Plus, and as I said in my Titanfall 2 review, I don't really mind a game being short if I think it's worth going back for more. Something you could very well be forgiven for forgetting, given that I said so many things in that video that I'm sort of at a loss for what to say about it now, aside from the obvious stuff like, hey, people who use the devotion, hemlock, and smart pistol, how does it feel to remember what breast milk tastes like? But really, I have reason to believe that a few Respawn employees have actually seen my Titanfall 2 review, and in case any of you are watching this video as well, I'd like to take this opportunity to address you directly. I am an obnoxious, cynical, bitchy piece of shit, and as a result, there are fair few AAA games that I find myself able to enjoy to the degree that I've enjoyed yours. With the sheer amount of moving parts in developing a game of this scale, I can honestly say that I can't even begin to understand how essentially every factor wound up being this fucking good. In so many words, I just wanted to say thank you for everything. Now, before anyone asks, I'm not going to be doing a list for my least favorite games of the year, because while I'm fairly confident that it'd get more views than this one, I feel that 12 reviews of No Man's Sky is just a bit excessive. And while I say a lot of non-politically correct garbage for, let's just call it comedic effect to save everyone time, I don't actually believe that the less fortunately able deserve public shaming and execution. So please, go ahead and leave a comment, as I'd love to be convinced otherwise.
But you and all your friends should get to leaving. I'm sure you'll be just fine. You do it all the time. All the tally marks on the walls of your mind. How do you feel, I ask, and you say it feels so good to be real, and someone else is staring at that very same moon. Oh, you're so smart, aren't you? And you and all your friends should stop repeating yourselves of what you want to do, and you feel around looking for somebody kinda new.